maybe onion and carrots can improve semen, but garlic can, on the other hand, dry it up. That melon may be great to aid sexual intercourse, while papaya can cause an abortion. And maybe peas can increase the supply of milk. The thing I want to convey, though, is that these are very local beliefs or ideas. But that we can actually find some trends in the belief systems when it comes to these traditions, cultures, and religious issues as related to reproduction and eating patterns. For instance, there are different ways of believing in eating down, which is basically meaning eating less throughout pregnancies. Some may think or find that eating too much will actually create big babies, and you might want to eat less just to facilitate your childbirth. But it could also be a conception that that maybe the child and the food is actually competing for space inside the mother. So to allowing enough space for the baby to develop, you might want to eat less. There could also be the notion that different parts of your life have either a hot or a cold bodily state, and so in the same way hotness, heat and coldness is attributed to different foods. So for instance, pregnancy could be a hot state, or is perceived a hot state in some places, and then you can't eat too much food that is associated with heat, because then excessive heat may cause illness, just as coldness, as you may be perceived to be in the postpartum state, can cause the same problems. You could also find the belief that whatever a pregnant woman will eat, her child will want throughout its life, so then you need to be very careful what you eat. And you may also be careful, you may be very careful that you do not eat something that will displease the gods, because they could take it out talking about revenge, as we did earlier today, on your child. However, I think that in summary, it's important to say that these beliefs can both be positive and negative. There are also some sayings and tradition that women should have more meat during pregnancy, more protein. But also that one thing is the tradition, the culture, and the beliefs. But if you want to study this, you also need to look very carefully at what the woman actually eats throughout her pregnancy and postpartum period, because there might actually not be a very strong linkage between the belief system and what she actually eats. In fact, there is stronger evidence that what is decisive for what a woman actually eats is food availability in the geographical area where she lives and where she finds herself. It could be her ability or the ability for her family to purchase that food, to access the food that is available in her local area. And then once the family has gotten hold of a great piece of meat, maybe you want to actually also have a look at who gets to eat what within the family. And there could easily be some gender disparities in who gets to eat what, with men maybe more often being the one who gets the nice piece of meat and the nutritional vegetables, while the girls and the women may have more of the stable foods. So in fact, this may have a greater impact on what women eat during the reproductive cycle. So we have a little bit of a focus on young people today, and pregnancy and adolescence is a particular concern when it comes to nutrition, because girls can actually become fertile before they themselves are fully grown. And obviously this will lead to a risk of competition for nutrients between the fetus and the girl themselves. And we already discussed the huge impact that the intergenerational consequences can be, in particular in terms of low birth weight, maybe if there's not enough nutrition neither to the mother or to the child or fetus. But while the consequences to the individual young mother and her child is great if the mother doesn't have enough nutrition, it may be very important for us to have a look at what is in fact the scope. Are we talking a few or or a larger group of people. Today we have in the world more than 400 young, well actually in less developed regions, more than 400 million young girls, younger than 18. And the issue of first child marriage is huge. It affects 1 in 3 outside China, I should add. And 1 in 5 girls give birth before they turn 18 in developed countries. So it's a huge amount of girls who give birth before they themselves are fully developed. 7.3 million births every year, and that's 20,000 births to very, very young girls every day. So it's a huge issue. And again, I'll just point to the photo. It's a photo that is part of an exhibition we have done in the UNFPA Nordic office with Plan International Sweden on the issue of very early motherhood. The girls that are featured in the exhibition for another couple of days, actually outside the Danish Parliament in an outdoor exhibition, all became mothers between the age of 13 and 15. So they are very, very young mothers. And certainly they haven't all had a great outcome, possibly because of nutrition. Young people is, in fact, one of the key target groups that we work with in UNFPA. And one of the things we do work with is stopping harmful traditional practices such as child marriage. Changing cultures that have been taking place throughout centuries and for thousands of years is not easy, and it's not something that we can come and say, you know, this is wrong, please stop. What we do is that we work with local authorities to show an alternative. Parents throughout the world want what's best for their children. If an early marriage is or girls' female genital mutilation, which is very much also a harmful traditional practice, is something that parents see as a way to give security and respect for their girls in the society, well, then that's what they will do. That's what they'll do. But if we work with the local authorities like local religious leaders, local health personnel, and the elderly, and make them see that, well, maybe we can make better use of a girl's resources if she stays in school. Maybe she will be able to help provide for her family and the community if she can also contribute to economic growth in our community. Then parents can help make a different decision for their children. But even stopping early marriage is not enough to maybe prevent early pregnancy. Young girls and young boys need to know what will happen to them in puberty. They'll need to know how you make children, how you basic information about your own body and how it works. So UNFPA also work to ensure access to comprehensive sexuality education. And as you would gather, even if you have the information, you also need the services once you become sexually active. That can be difficulty in itself. So youth-friendly services, access to contraception is also one of the things we do. Enabling, as I said, youth to fulfill their full potential, to not be overtaken by adulthood before they can make adult choices for themselves. In the world we live in, we always need to make the economic argument also, even if these are really basic human rights issues for the young people themselves. And the thing is that if we enable young people in countries that now have a very fast population growth and where there's currently being born many children, that means primarily the countries in sub-Saharan Africa. If you enable youth in those countries to postpone their childbearing and to only have the children they would like once they become adults and make that choice for themselves, then you have a population structure where you have a fairly small elderly group because you have had a huge population growth. And if you enable young people to only have the children they would like when they would like them, you will have again a smaller group of children. This means that for some decades you will have a relatively large portion of the population in the working age, and this can really spur or be contributing to economic development. But this is about nutrition. So I would like to end my presentation with linking back to nutrition with another quote, and one that I hope won't be seen as provocative to our nutritionists. That's certainly not the intention, but again, a slightly different view. This is a quote by co-written by one of our colleagues in our technical division in New York, in a paper on adolescent health and nutrition. And the quote says, "Postponing age at marriage and thus first pregnancy is arguably the most important nutrition intervention among this vulnerable age group." So, on that note, and with an invitation to follow UNFPA on the social media, thank you.
I think tremendous set of presentations. Thank you so much. So we have lots of questions and some anonymous, I can see. So that should be fun, but maybe a few questions from the room, or would you, or shall we start with yes sir or madam?
I got one question, by the way, one comment in passing, which is that there is one disorder which is more prevalent than obesity, that's depression, which is actually, of course, highly interconnected. But listening to you, what strikes me, maybe being a psychiatrist, is how little you refer to specific psychological incentives. I think culture is clearly population-wide, it's sustainable, but highly influenceable. If you look at the impact of McDonald's in Paris, you can see that you actually can change cultural patterns very fast with the right incentives, with the right advertising. But what bothers me about the presentations, and that's really linked to a question, is that I see two opposite phenomena. One which is cheaper food, accessible, tasty, McDonald's, etc., to lower income groups. But what you're referring to is largely relevant to higher income groups. I mean, nice local cultural foods, locally produced, well prepared. Yes, I mean, come around to me for dinner. But I wonder how relevant it is to these lower income groups. Really, my question is, look, what you are describing, how can that be made relevant to people who are struggling to pay for their food when so much of the cheaper food available is not healthy?
Well, I can start. I don't have well, I mean, I think I fully agree with you. There's no, of course, but there is no silver bullet or, simple solutions to that fact. In reality, I mean, some argue that you need sort of a food revolution, which is you need to think about food systems in a completely different way. And you need probably shorter food chains and, I mean, circumstances where most deprived people actually have access to healthier foods in urban contexts and others. There's experiences of, going on in many big cities that really try to change these food systems. And it's very challenging, but that's what we have to do.
Disagree with your first statement and agree with the second. McDonald's in France has changed the food patterns, etc., but France has changed McDonald's considerably, because there have been several studies about the use of McDonald's restaurants in France, and I myself spent 2 days in McDonald's restaurants in the city of Dijon, years ago, and it was very interesting. It turns out that people tend to use McDonald's as restaurant. That is, they come in groups, they order more items than do Americans, they come at lunchtime. 80% of McDonald's business, based on their own statements, occurs at meal times. And they've adjusted to the local needs. And if you think about Italy, it probably is to a large extent similar. And historically speaking, the slow food movement was founded in 1986 on the basis of a huge demonstration in front of a newly opening McDonald's restaurants on Piazza di Spagna in Rome. So there is a degree of interactions. And as to the next statement, as the inequalities, I think that's what I had in mind when I made this statement, that the example, the precedent of the US and the constant attempts to change people's food habits, to induce immigrants to become more American. For instance, Italians were taught to be more American, and then 50 years later, Americans are taught to be more Italian. That sort of thing. This all shows that in retrospect, we probably have some responsibility, and when I say we, I mean people involved in public health, I mean meaning well, etc. There probably are some consequences of past campaigns and programs that actually increase what you've been describing, that is, on the one hand, the foodie phenomenon, and on the other hand, people who keep listening to what we say, or what is told to them by all kinds of various instances, because we live in a cacophony of advice and directions, right? So on the one hand, you have people who follow everything passionately and quite to a degree irrationally, and on the other hand, the people that we target that remain out of reach to a large extent.
Again, the top question through Slido is from an anonymous source, and it asks, how can industry be incentivized to produce healthy food?
Easy question, João.
Well, I mean, where there is a market, the food industry certainly will move there, but we are not at that point yet, I would say. So the mainstream is not so much on healthy foods, and those products that are, probably they are designed for consumers that are more affluent and have more resources and so on. So very bluntly, if you ask me, give me one single intervention that can incentivize industry in terms of the right direction, I would say that, well, we can regulate, for example, over a maximum amount of sugar in soft drinks, just to give you an example. And a lot of other things we can do. So the best incentive for the food industry, in my view, is to create a level playing field, and is to use the power of the people and governments.
Then we have a question from Veronica Polozkova. Could you please indicate research priorities and gaps for this topic? What proof do we need as soon as possible to be able to formulate targeted recommendations? Another big question?
You turn to me.
I don't want to take them all.
All right, let me be provocative.
Yeah.
I just said we live in a cacophony of prescriptions, prohibitions. People live in a cacophony of magazines, media, directions, prescriptions from the public sector, from the private sector. And what we find, social scientists, when we interview people and we survey them, and that they're absolutely at a loss in many cases, in many respects. So my first conclusion would be, but that may sound very provocative. My recommendation would be enough with recommendations.
Except the WHO answer.
I'm prepared to accept discussing that, target problems, specific identifiable problems in certain sectors of the population that you can somehow intervene and try to devise the best possible intervention program projects where you're going to make an experiment. It's in many cases, for instance, the issue of taxation. I mean, people keep asking about taxation. It's an empirical issue. You can test it. It depends on the product, it depends on the people, it depends on the situation, etc. In some cases, well, I mean, the Danish experience is a little particular, I understand, but
But it works.
okay. So that's my, be pragmatic and realistic, and when I say realistic, it has to be science-based and experience-based, and take nothing for granted. I wouldn't take for granted that we need recommendations.
Thank you.
Well, first, thank you so much, because I feel like a kid on the candy store, being here with you guys, providing all this useful knowledge and information that hopefully we can use it on our daily lives. My question is, in some of the presentation, it was expressed that social behavior studies and recommendations and reproductions and food. But what would be the message to the people engaged here, to us, and those online, the direct message? What can we do individually to make our world a healthier, a better place? How can we do it? How can we start tomorrow to be healthier? How can we start or tell our friends, our colleagues, by the way, why don't you try this so it could be, so we could have a direct impact on these people here, on those listening, rather than I'm going to read a research or I'm going to try to change social behaviors or invite people for lunch or so on, or next. So that's my question.
I mean, yeah, we have to, advice needs to be simple, needs to be changeable, but people need to be able to really adopt that behavior in an easy fashion. I mean, it's commonplace to say the healthier behaviors need to be made easy. And that's why all these things about regulation and nudging and everything come together. So, I mean, you can do that at the individual level. You can work with your family and with your friends and people surrounding you, but you also need a supportive environment. So it's very, I mean, I can't see, it's difficult to be prescriptive, but it's important to be informed. Most people are, however, informed, and still they don't adopt the right behaviors, So it's more complex than that. Just, informing about things is really way not enough. So, but we have simple advice normally works, and people having the choice, having the right choice, sometimes it's possible. Quite often you don't have the right choice, and you react by impulse. I mean, you go to our canteen and it's full of, stuff that you buy by impulse. I mean, sweets and, and this and that, it's at the counter. I mean, we could use the UN canteen as the example of really not the ideal environment in terms of food offer. I mean, to be honest, sorry, I'm also being provocative, but at this moment, that's fine. but it's true, So you work with your friends and colleagues, but then we go there, we have 15 minutes, what happens, So you really need a combination of individual, and, higher level approach.
I can see a targeted question for Mette and Slido. And do you use research from the humanities and social sciences in your program activities?
Well, we do very much so. as I said, working with culture, you really need to work from the bottom up. So you need to have your starting point in the humanities and the social sciences. But I think maybe what is also interesting is that it has something to do with the whole approach of how programming is done, not only in UNFPA, but in many UN agencies, which is that we came from, in the 70s and 80s, basic need approach, where the doctors would know that if you had a woman sitting in front of you who expressed that she didn't want to get pregnant, maybe you had an IUD at hand, and maybe that would then what you thought was best for her. But with a human rights approach, as we are implementing today, it's really the woman or the man who is the expert in his or her own life, and the service provider becomes more of a facilitator in telling the person what are the options, and trying to negotiate or to understand what will fit best to the woman's life. And ultimately it's the woman herself who makes the decision. So that sort of stresses the need for social science and humanities to understand the environment you're working in. You're not coming as the expert who knows all. You're coming there to understand and to enable local authorities and service providers to meet the human rights of the people you serve.
I can see an anonymous comment that shows the need to look at eating patterns, not single foods, and nutrients. This is what nutritionists, dietitians are helping people day to day say. But I've noticed a really, well, is it someone from this room? One key factor is that women do not want to go back into the kitchen, and rightly so. Do you agree? Discuss.
Well, I'm not sure exactly why they should.
Yeah.
I mean, the implicit is that it's in the question is that it is their job to do the cooking. I suppose we're beyond that, right? But one really serious issue, of course, which is behind this question is, do we have to go back to the kitchen and cook meals, etc.? That's a line of thought, and particularly in the US. And for instance, Michael Pollan has been very proactive on this, and I'm a little skeptical about, I don't quite understand why people who have a lot of activities on their hands would go back to against the trend of convenience. So we might as well try to think along the line of using technology and industry to provide better quality food. It doesn't necessarily have to go back to growing our garden. We can do it, of course, and we can see that a number of people have actually divided their life into at least two areas. One part of the time when they eat, and another during I'm trying to translate expressions I hear in French, and one during weekend when they dine. So cooking and eating become a leisure activity as opposed to every day when you just slap together something to eat. And it's the evolution of urban societies already, and it's, I think, what has to be done is look at the quality of whatever provenance or convenience type of food it is. And I think that's one of the role of scientists and nutritionists to orientate the production and the consumption. I don't think why, I don't understand why should we go back to peeling things that we can buy already peeled, etc. I can do it on weekends if I have time, if I enjoy it. But I don't think it would be very effective to try to talk people into working more for their eating. On the other hand, you might want to talk them into being prepared to spend more on their eating, which is, apparently in a paradoxical way what slow food has been doing. There were former radical leftists in the 70s and turned to this movement later on, and they are actually openly saying, Petrini is saying, people should be accepting to spend more for their food. Look at the differences in percent of household income devoted to food. The prediction of the statisticians in the 19th century was, as people grow, have more income, a smaller part of their budget would be devoted to basic needs, including food, because of course we're not going to eat 10 times a day if we're 10 times richer. So, but what happens is that countries with similar level of wealth actually have very different percentages of nutrition, of household income devoted to food. We have 12 or 13% in France, and it's under 6% in the US, according to statistics. So they spend very little of their budget on food that is massively available in poor quality, and I'm sure that, I suspect that is not a very good idea. So cheap, abundant, trivialized food does not sound like a good idea, and that's why I like the new Nordic diet idea very much, except that it might be a little too elite so far, but because it's aimed at improving the quality, and it's in a way positive nutrition, not negative nutrition. But that's just personal judgment.
Last question from the room, please.
I think that I would respectfully disagree with a bit of that. That actually,
Go back to the kitchen?
The family, to go back to the kitchen, not necessarily me as a woman, but the family. I think the act of peeling your own vegetables or, preparing your own duck or whatever animal it might be actually connects you to the food and the source of food. It makes you aware of this whole cycle of life, that it actually takes months for things to grow, that you can't just buy it at the store and throw it away if it has a little spot. You have a bit more respect for it. And I think that's also important in educating people and educating families. When you're preparing this food with your children or with your grandparents, everyone's involved in that. And by educating people is how you actually kind of create this culture change, even if it's only within the family. It starts to create that.
I'm sorry, I'm 100% in agreement with this. But it's difficult when you commute 2 or 3 hours a day, and you will have to do it on weekends or at school, which is already the case in some schools. But it's not a realistic proposition in the large urban settings for people who are working and having the problems with urban life that we witness. And 80% of the world population is or will be living in cities that get larger and larger, so there's a problem.
I think we're running out of time, so there are lots of good questions on Slido. I'd encourage people who want to discuss things further to write to the presenters. If you can't get their emails, write to us and we'll forward the emails. I'd just like to add that curries actually can be cooked on the weekend and get better as the days go on. So healthy curry eating, my 2 cents in this but thank you so much everybody for joining us, and thank you again to the speakers, all our WHO colleagues, and Mette, we hope we can keep working with, I know you will work with our colleagues in WHO, but I hope you work with a bigger network of academics as well. So thank you everyone. Thank you.